The history that I trace of the experience of public service reform, uh, I trace it in terms of a number of models. I begin with the original, if you like, the Weberian public administration model, which dominated in the post-independence period, where newly independent governments were trying to establish basic institutional structures and build capacity. Then we had the need to reduce public expenditure as a result of the oil price shocks of the late 1970s. And then we had a period where and what was on many people's minds was the need to downsize the civil service. So you had an emphasis on reducing the size of the civil service, reducing the spending on the public payroll, and then also an emphasis on pay reform so that you were decompressing pay, that is, you were increasing the pay of the senior civil servants relative to the pay of the junior civil servants, since the senior civil servants were reckoned to be the ones who determined the strategic direction of the public service. Now, that approach to public service reform is largely seen to have failed. Of course, there is always going to be an imperative to keep public expenditure in check, but the assessment of IMF, World Bank, and IMF, World Bank were very much in the lead with this model of reform, is that in many, many, many places, spending did not reduce, numbers did not go down, and of course, since no one was focusing on the quality of public service provision, that stagnated at best. Then we had what I see as a separate stream of thinking about public service reform, the new public management, which I see as emerging in the OECD countries, especially the Anglo-Saxon countries, at the point where governments said, well, we've downsized as much as it's possible to do. What do we do with what's left? We'd better try to get it to perform properly. We can't privatize everything. We can't reduce the state to zero. And so you had an emphasis on NPM measures, which are quite well known. You had managerial devolution, the creation of so-called executive agencies, delegating authority to heads of service in government. You had in developing countries the emergence of the independent revenue authorities, which really are based on the same principles. And then you had, let's call it for short, managerial reforms, human resource management, management of information, and so on. To some extent, bringing the public sector, allowing the public sector to catch up with what the private sector had been doing. All right, so we had that strand, that stream of thinking. Then another strand of thinking was that, well, all of these models have their origins in industrialized countries. There is something called context. We discovered context. We said that there is a political context, there is a cultural and an institutional context to which we ought to adapt these international so-called best practice models. And so we saw the rise of ideas of adaptation. We have very recently the problem-driven iterative analysis, which Lant Pritchett, Matt Andrews, Michael Woolcock, World Bank, at Harvard rather, and we ourselves at the World Bank have been exploring. So I suppose we bringing the history up to date. What we have at the moment is that we start from where governments are with the problems that they're trying to solve, as my colleague Nick Manning here at the World Bank says, looking at where the shoe pinches. Now then, what this paper, reading one, specifically does, as well as recapitulate that history, is to say, well, it's all very well to say that governments are trying to solve problems, but they don't start from scratch. And if the only, as you try to solve your problems, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem becomes a nail. And so, as well as recapitulating that history, what the paper tries to do is to say, here are a number of ideal type models of public service reform. It's very useful for reformers and for development partners to have them in their mind, so that if a government says we're trying to solve problem X, then the reformer, the development partner can say, well, in that case, the approach that you may like to try is this one. It takes as its starting point the French word is problématique, the problem situation that governments have. It may be that a particular government is needing to emphasize getting closer to the people. This is, government of Myanmar, where I'm doing a lot of work, is saying, well, we have a legacy of military top-down government. We need to go out and listen to the people. That's the overriding imperative for us. And then my version of the problem-solving approach goes a step further, perhaps, than the World Bank approach to public sector reform or Andrews, Pritchett, Woolcock, in that it says, well, in helping governments to solve their specific problems, it's helpful to have arrangement. The role, I would say, is that politics and institutions are key elements of the context. When we try to tailor a reform approach to the context of a particular government, then we need to be aware of politics, to be a little more concrete. We need to be aware very often that patronage is quite ingrained, that it takes a particular form, and that you need to have reform instruments that are tailored to that political context. You can't pretend that you can introduce one of the international best practice models without considering the political situation in which you're introducing it. And similarly, on the institutions, then you must be aware that every government has its own institutional architecture. Now, to give a concrete example of that one, I would see Malaysia as being a country which has an extreme top-down, centrally driven executive. Malaysia is formally a federation, but its states have been described as merely operating agencies of the federal government. Closer to the other extreme, I would see countries like Morocco and Myanmar, where the line ministries have more power than the centre. So in Myanmar, for example, where we're working with the Office of the President, has made us aware that we need to, together, to come up with approaches that take account of the fact that some of the line ministries are quite powerful and that the Office of the President has to work with them and cannot simply impose its authority. No, we do not have satisfactory evidence. I will be quite frank about that. Now, I should say that you are posing the question in a modern form. That is, that it's only recently, I would say, following the rise of MDGs and their rather slow filtering into the development mainstream, we've we have this interest in the outcomes of reform, the impact on maternal mortality, literacy at age 7 and so on. We have that interest within the public service reform circle only quite recently. That's the first point. The second point then is that, well, I am conceding that the evidence is not satisfactory. If you then go on to say, if you go on to ask me, such as it is, what's the best evidence? Then the example that I'm going to point to, the two examples I'm going to point to are Malaysia and Indonesia, examples which I happen to know because I'm in the East Asia Pacific region here at the World Bank. We have quite strong evidence that Malaysia, by introducing a delivery unit known as Pemandu, which influenced very heavily by the UK's Performance Management and Delivery Unit under Tony Blair, 2001-2010, run by Michael Barber, that introducing that delivery unit has led to substantial, quite rapid improvements in priority areas which the government identified, which include rural infrastructure, literacy and numeracy, use of urban public transport. And similarly in Indonesia, the new president in his second term in office right at the beginning said, I have targets for my first 100 days. We're going to deliver on commitments that the government has previously had but failed to achieve. And in fact, those commitments were almost, or there were 100 and something of them, and all but 2 of them were delivered. Now, one swallow or even 2 swallows don't make a summer. This evidence is very limited. It's promising, and what I think is interesting is that this evidence, limited though it is, has been very appealing in a number of other places. So, for example, the government of Tanzania, with support from DFID, so DFID knows this, has brought in Pemandu from Malaysia to do something similar themselves. And there are other countries, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Chile, Sao Paulo in Brazil, Romania, Albania, which are taking the same approach. I should say varying degrees of success, as is usual. The short answer to your question, do we have satisfactory evidence? No, we don't. One reason for that is because we've only recently got interested in this. But such as it is, there is some promising evidence in Malaysia, Indonesia, and governments elsewhere have shown that they're interested. I suppose I'm temperamentally an incrementalist. We do have revolutionary situations where a kind of year zero is enforced on a country by external factors, but I favour incrementalism because, you know, as I position myself in a school of thought, Charles Lindblom, Henry Mintzberg and others, who have emphasized the importance of policy learning. Karl Popper is my guru on this. Trial and error, that we try something, it produces unintended consequences, almost, I would say always, not almost always. Why so? Because we're making an intervention in a complex system. And you simply cannot predict the effects of an intervention in a complex system. So you need to try it, then adjust as you go along so that you can compensate for those unintended consequences. And that's another way of saying incrementalism. One more thing. It's not very exciting, but I think it's important. Hang in there. Hang in there. So very often the approach is right and the timing is wrong. So very often we make the proposal and we think we've been knocked back. In fact, we have been knocked back on it. But what's happening is the political system is digesting it. And here I'm thinking of our role as development partners. You know, that we make a proposal, perhaps it's one where we are sure that the government is committed to it, and yet the proposal appears to die. We know from Hirschman that there's a sort of that the reform stream goes underground, like happens in the Peak, in limestone country in the Peak District. And we think it's just disappeared. And then lo and behold, it gushes forth. Because what's been happening is that behind the scenes, there has been, below the development partner radar, there has been a ferment of reform-minded intellectuals, people in the government. My example of this is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka only carried out a serious public service reform after all of the donors had completely given up. But what had happened was that Sri Lanka was processing it on its own. And so eventually it came up with a more radical reform than any of the donors would ever suggest. So very simply, hang in there. We get knocked back today. Maybe we'll finish our 3 years, 5 years in the country, but it may well be, we've seen it many times, that our blueprint is the one to which reformers return 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, even 10 years down the line. I'm from Northern Ireland, and in 1998 we had something called the Good Friday Agreement, which finally solved the problems of Northern Ireland, as we can see, 16 years further on. The Good Friday Agreement was described by one of Northern Ireland's leading politicians as Sunningdale for slow learners. What he meant was that in 1974, 24 years earlier, there had been an earlier agreement, but it wasn't possible to line up the political players at the time. But if you compare the Sunningdale Agreement with the Good Friday Agreement 24 years later, they are so similar to each other. Sunningdale for slow learners. Very often reformers, even we development partners, are slow learners too.